Hi, this is Lola Cornish. I'm with Strategies TA, and I have the honor and privilege of announcing Paul Collier, who is going to be presenting on the Data Playbook. And I have to say, in this prevention space, gears have been turning independently for a long time, and it's beautiful to see them finally coming together into what we hope will become a seamless system. And data is certainly a huge piece of that. So I'll let you take it away, Paul.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Lola. I appreciate it. And also you were one of the most helpful people in drafting this whole thing. So very appropriate that you introduced me here. So super excited to be with everybody today. We're talking about the Data Playbook for Prevention Action Planning. This is a new resource that's been developed with partnership from many folks around the state, including OCAP, to really help prevention planning teams make the most out of data as part of their planning process. So the objective for this today is I wanted to give you an overview of what exactly is in here. You know, this is a pretty dense resource. And for those of you who are never going to have the opportunity to read this, I want to give you the key points about the Data Playbook and also give you a taste for what is in here so that if you do dive in and explore it in more depth, you know what to expect. So what are we going to do today? We'll start with some background. Who am I? Why was Safe and Sound involved in this process? And sort of touch base on why the Data Playbook is so important. Then we'll really spend most of our time jumping through some of the big ideas from the Data Playbook. And we've got 3 chapters in this resource. The first is around planning for success with using data. The second is engaging your community with data. And the third is around telling your story. And then we'll talk about next steps, where to find this, how to get some additional help. So first, I'd love to hear from you, and I'm going to try and make this interactive. So Kathy, please launch this poll. I'm curious, so who in your prevention planning team is responsible for finding relevant community data? And just select the answer that makes the most sense. You should see the poll on your screen right now, and you can select one of these options. It could be one person in your team, maybe it's a consultant, maybe it's a subcommittee of your team, maybe everybody, or maybe nobody. So just take a second here, give me a response, and we'll leave this open for maybe another 10 seconds or so. Just kind of curious where everybody's at. Kathy, let's kind of close this and see where folks are at here. I'm actually really curious myself. Hopefully this will show us. Okay, wow, what a distribution, huh? It looks like the responses cluster around a subcommittee of our planning team or all members of your planning team. So we're going to talk quite a bit about how to find relevant community data here. So if you are that subcommittee member, definitely pay attention, or if you're one of those teams where everybody is responsible for finding data, definitely pay attention to the first half of this, because I think that this should really speak to either what you've already experienced or what you soon will experience as part of your planning process. Awesome. Next slide, please. So who am I and why is Safe and Sound involved in this? Safe and Sound is a community-based organization based in San Francisco. We've been around for almost 50 years. And the bulk of Safe and Sound's work is directly working with families, parents, caregivers, and children through our Family Resource Center, which is located in the city of San Francisco. In addition to that direct service work, we also serve as the Child Abuse Prevention Center for San Francisco and Marin counties, and we operate the San Francisco Children's Advocacy Center. So we have a role to play in educating, collaborating, and advocating for child abuse prevention in San Francisco and the greater Bay Area. I was on the team for several years as our internal data and evaluation manager. And then when I left the team full time and I became a consultant, the Safe and Sound team asked me to serve as the project manager for this economics of abuse project. And Michelle, you guys did an awesome job selling the economics of abuse tool. It's available for everybody, and hopefully everybody now knows where to find it. I'll touch on it in a second, but that was really the introduction to us being involved in creating tools to help communities really use data to make the case for investing in prevention. So, long story short, one thing led to another, and OCAP asked us to partner with them in helping create this data playbook tool to support counties in really integrating data into their prevention planning processes. Next slide. So here's that cost calculator. And Michelle, you guys sold this. I'm not going to tell you too much more, but do go check it out. It's economics.safeandsound.org. You can enter your county in there. I have been deeply involved in this, and I can tell you that we have the most up-to-date data through 2021 on that site. So you can figure out what's an estimate of the economic impact of child maltreatment for last year on this website, and use this as part of your advocacy efforts. Okay, so we're talking about this new tool, which you can also find on that same website, this Data Playbook for Prevention Action Planning. And I'm really excited because as the prior speakers have talked about, using data is an integral part of how do you create a prevention plan that really meets your community's needs. So wanted to just share a little bit about how we got to this process. If you go to the next slide, we can talk about who are our partners in developing this. So Safe and Sound, we've gotten experience doing this planning process, but we really approach this as a peer. There are a lot of folks that we wanted to get involvement from and input from in designing this resource. So one of the first things that we did was we talked with 10 different prevention planning teams from around the state who have each done something really, really unique and valuable in terms of using data. So we talked with folks from Contra Costa County, Kern County, Lake, Marin, San Diego, Ventura, San Francisco, San Luis Obispo, Santa Cruz, and Shasta counties. And they gave us some really helpful input that informed what we decided to put into the Data Playbook. In addition, OCAP helped connect us to several other individuals and organizations that have a stake and provided really helpful feedback on the drafts. So folks involved in the drafting process represented California's Child Welfare and Learning and Evaluation Bureau, our Department of Public Health, of course, the Office of Child Abuse Prevention, Casey Family Programs, Strategies, TA, Lola, and Sarah were hugely helpful. The California Child and Family Enrichment Cabinet and Ventura County's prevention planning team actually served as test reviewers for this tool. So it was truly a team effort, and I can only take so much credit for this, but I get to be the messenger. So lucky me. Thank you so much for all the folks that have played a role in this process so far. So let's just talk a little bit about why this matters. What I want to mention here is that we're not talking about data for data's sake. What we're trying to do is create really effective prevention plans that serve our communities well. And so David Swanson Hollinger said this better than I can myself. He said, I think it's about helping families before it gets to child welfare. We need leadership from system, public partners, private agencies, and the community to support and strengthen our families. So again, we're talking about data used for prevention planning, but data isn't the end game. Effective strategies that support our communities are the end game here. Roger DeLeon from Riverside also shared, I think, a really important point. He said, it's important and respectful to understand the challenges parents face. By collecting community level data, county planning efforts will have a better chance at helping families be safe and stay together. So throughout this, even though we're talking about some maybe wonky, some technical stuff, I'm trying to keep in mind, and I urge you to keep in mind, we're trying to be respectful to our communities by truly understanding the challenges that parents and families face. So that's where we're coming from in this whole conversation. So what's in the Data Playbook? It's organized in these 3 sections. So really the first chapter is what you see in purple here. And this is planning for success. These are things that your prevention planning team can do to engage with data on your own before engaging community members to collect additional data or around that data. So we'll talk through several of those steps. And I'm guessing that many of your teams have already done at least some of these. The green sections here, chapter 2, represents ways that you can engage your community with data. And so that can look like asking for feedback. It can also look like engaging community members in analyzing, helping you make sense of their input. And then the third and final section focuses on communication. So how do you present data in an engaging way and use it to help tell your prevention planning story? So we'll touch on that a little bit here at the end. So as I mentioned, chapter 1, we're going to be diving into how some things that we can do to really plan for using data well. And so this chapter includes the following sections. So the first is making the case for using data in prevention planning. And I actually think that Michelle, Sheila, Freeney have made the case already. So I'm not going to spend too much time on this topic here. We'll jump right into the second section, which is how do you help your prevention planning team members really build the necessary data leadership skills to engage with whatever community data that you have. The third section goes into selecting a framework that helps you really narrow in and organize the data that you want to look at. And then the fourth and fifth sections explore how do we find existing community data. So we'll talk about each of those in turn. So in terms of important data leadership skills, one of the concepts that we think is pretty foundational to this is understanding the difference between using data for planning purposes and data for adapting something already going on. And both are really valid. Your prevention planning team may explore both, but conceptually, if you're using data to plan something new or to plan a new intervention, you're looking at information about the problem, your community context, and potential solutions that you might be able to use to solve problems or challenges in your community. So this is the sort of general data use that we're talking about here. Let's contrast that with using data for adaptation. And one of the most common sort of scenarios of data use like this is in program evaluation. So when we're doing a program evaluation, we're collecting data on implementation. Are we doing our work with fidelity? We're collecting data on the consequences of our program. What are the positive results? What are the negative results? And ultimately on the impact, both individual outcomes and changes at the community level. That kind of data use is super important. And we'll use some of that data too, potentially as we're informing our next steps. But between these two purposes of using data, the data playbook focuses more on data for planning purposes. So I wanted to share that because you might think there are a lot of other concepts that are important to evaluation that you don't see in here. And that's true. That's a conscious decision for us to really focus on how do we use data to make a good plan, to choose solutions or choose ways to expand solutions in our communities. So some of the other data leadership skills that we think are really important for folks. Prevention planning team members should have or develop skills for integrating data into decisions. So knowing when to ask for data and knowing to just ask that question. What does the data say when we're making an important choice? That's an important skill, a baseline for folks to have. And then some skills around interpreting data products. So understanding where does this data come from? Can I trust the source? What can I learn from it? How can I use this, or how can we use this to make an effective prevention plan? Those are some basic behaviors, some basic habits, if you will, that I think we hope that all prevention planning team members either have or are able to build throughout this planning process. And then some things to just be aware of. I think it's important for prevention planning team members to know the different kinds of data used. We've mentioned data for planning versus adaptation. It's also important to understand why data quality is so important. Ultimately, if you have high quality data, it contributes to information that is sort of data placed in context, to knowledge, data placed in context that can be applied, and to wisdom. So, all of that taken in line with your team's values and your team's objectives. So data quality is sort of the fundamental asset to really making important, meaningful, wise decisions with data. And then finally, just being aware of common biases. Everybody has a certain kind of bias. And so just an awareness of common biases in interpreting data, like confirmation bias, selection bias, positionality, that is the history that we bring to data, that is super helpful in allowing us to really foster processes that help us make good decisions, because then we can think, how do we design a process of engaging with data that avoids some of these biases? So those are some of the key data leadership skills. We go into a lot more depth in the data playbook, but want to just provide a summary of some of these things here for y'all to understand and use as a foundation. One of the less obvious, recommendations that came out of our process of engaging counties in talking about data was the importance of having a data framework. So if data framework is just, a way of organizing the many kinds of community data that you could be looking at. And there are 4 examples that we look at here in the data playbook. So we explore the social determinants of health, the 5 protective factors, the Strengthening Families 5 Protective Factors framework, the Building Community Resilience model, and the Adverse Community Experiences and Resilience framework. So there are these 4 options, and each have pros and cons. None is wrong. Some might be right in certain circumstances. But choosing a data framework can really be helpful in defining the scope of the community data that you want to look at. And it helps you communicate what data you're looking at, because certain frameworks resonate with certain audiences. And so it can be very helpful from a communication standpoint to pick a data framework before you start pulling metrics and looking at a wide array of community data. So to make this, I think, a little bit more practical, a little bit more applied, let's kind of talk through an example. So let's go to the next slide. If we imagine that we picked the Adverse Community Experiences and Resilience framework, so that's our data framework. So this framework essentially argues that there are 3 important aspects to understand in a community that help us help us avoid adverse community experiences and build communities where families have everything that they need to be resilient. So those 3 aspects are equitable access to opportunity, the people environment, and the place-based environment. And so if we use that framework to organize our data to help us look at community data, if we start with the equitable opportunity aspect of this, some of the data points we might look at. We might look at households under 20% of poverty. We might look at unemployment rates, rates of savings and wealth building, business investment trends, and maybe perceptions of opportunity. So things to kind of just keep in mind as we're looking at these, regardless of the framework, you want to look at indicators of both community assets or strengths, as well as community challenges. Both sides of that equation are important, and many data sources will focus more on sides of community weakness than community strength. It's also important to understand not just sort of procedurally collected data, but individual perceptions. What are people's perceptions about this area? Because that might differ than some of the other data points. So let's talk through the other 2 quickly. So if we go to the next aspect, people, some data points about the sort of people environment could include family composition, access to healthcare, child maltreatment rates, perceptions of trust and agency, social norms and any common narratives that are seen among families in our community, and any sense of culture or shared identity that's happening in our county. And then finally, for place, some of the aspects here could include housing availability, home ownership rates, quality of public spaces, crime rates, and perceptions of safety. So hopefully this helps you sort of see, okay, a data framework can really help us zoom in and narrow onto particular aspects of the data that we ought to be looking at. It makes our job a little bit easier. It makes it more possible for us to look at data points that really describe important aspects about our community. So I'm curious now, let's have us all just kind of type in the chat. What data sources have you or your prevention team found valuable in exploring your community so far? And if you haven't looked at any data sources, you don't need to respond, but if you have, or if you've got one that you really love, I would love to just see that in the chat right now so that we can see what data sources other folks have actually used. Awesome, Clarissa, I'm seeing kids data. You'll see that here in a second. Anybody else have one that they've used and they really like? Thanks, Lisa. Yep, local offer C data, the Child Welfare Indicators Project, Safe Measures, absolutely. Casey, yep, Children Now. Thank you, Lola. Okay, y'all are stealing my thunder here because there are most of these sources actually are sources that we include in the data playbook. I'm seeing the racial equity access. Elizabeth, you mentioned that one. That one isn't in there, but it sounds like a really good resource. So feel free to keep these coming because I think we can all learn from each other. We're all new-ish in this planning process. So I want to just make the point, this data playbook is not the end-all be-all resource, but we are hopeful it is a really good starting point. We wanted to give folks a top 10 list of existing sources for community data. And these aren't your only sources, but maybe these can be some of the sources you go to first if you haven't explored community data yet. And many of the things that folks have mentioned here are on this list. Like Judy, you mentioned the opportunity map. Casey Opportunity Map, I think, is actually maybe the first source that we would suggest folks go to because it is pretty easy to use and it has data on education, housing, family well-being, and accessibility. So it covers a lot of ground in a way that's pretty user-friendly. So I think, we kind of list this in potential order of utility. So next is the Prosperity Now scorecard. Exactly. The source, this is a really great source for family income and asset information, so economic information. Among census data, these narrative profiles from the American Community Survey are probably the most user-friendly of the census's data sources, and they provide pretty comprehensive community demographics. Kids data is another great source. The superpower of kids data from our point of view is they're kid-specific indicators around school safety, childcare, child behavioral health. They have some unique data points that several of these others don't. The Strong Start Index is a very interesting one. It really is one summary metric that can be compared neighborhood by neighborhood. And so I'll show you a screenshot of that here in a bit just to see how valuable that is. Let's go to the next slide. So the number 6 resource on this list is the Children Now County Scorecard. That's really great comparing one county to another. They've got some super user-friendly visualizations. The California Child Welfare Indicators Project is sort of the go-to, or at least my go-to, for up-to-date statewide child welfare system data and child maltreatment data. So the Economics of Abuse interactive website, the Safe and Sounds project for the last several years really focuses on quantifying the impacts of child maltreatment in your county. And the Sacramento team did a great job illustrating how they've been able to use that to talk about how costly this issue is for their region. A couple more to mention. The California Health and Human Services Department has these county health status profiles. They have some unique information around health, particularly maternal health care, that can't be found in some of the others. And then last but not least, this last source policy map is a really comprehensive national data source that you can really use to zoom into counties, cities, zip codes, even census tracts. So if you can't find a data point elsewhere, you can potentially find it there. It's a little bit more complicated than some of the other resources. And so I wouldn't say go there first, but definitely go there if you're having a hard time finding some other data points. Okay, so we've talked about how do you access some existing data? How do you plan for engaging with data well? Let's go to the next slide. So now many counties find it helpful to engage with their community in some way. And the reality is everybody's doing this. We've already talked about many ways of engaging the voice of community members with lived experience of adverse community situations in your planning process. So here are some ways of doing that. Let's go to the next slide. If you have a data framework, you're collecting and aggregating existing data, you'll probably find there are some gaps, and you'll probably want to collect some new feedback from your community. Before doing so, just keep in mind the following risks. So I think the first is representativeness. It's so hard to get representative community data, and that doesn't mean you shouldn't do it. You just need to keep in mind who is included and who's excluded in reviewing any community information. there are always going to be some people who can't participate in whatever method you have. And just being mindful about that perspective as well is important when really making sense of whatever data you're able to collect. That leads us to the second point, accessibility. So you want to make it really easy for your community members to engage with you. So having multiple ways to provide feedback and not just one approach helps with accessibility. And there's a whole list of other accessibility considerations related to language, related to timing and place. The data playbook goes into that in more depth. The third is fatigue. It's important to understand who's already asked your community for input. Try and leverage some of that existing data from other folks who have asked families about what they're hoping for, what their dreams are, before you go and collect your own. And then the final is trust. You should be considering working through an organization that's a trusted entity. I know that Michelle and Sheila, the Sacramento team, said, we work through some of our local family resource centers, we inherit their trust. You want to think about collecting data through entities that have that community trust, because you'll get better engagement. You also want to make sure that you are using somebody's data trustfully, or in a way that is trustworthy. So if you're collecting feedback, make decisions with that feedback in mind and tell your community how that feedback informed choices that were made going forward. So let's go to the next slide. The data playbook outlines several different ways of collecting new information from your community. And most of these are not rocket science and probably aren't new to you. What we do in the data playbook is really discuss some of the strengths and limitations of each of these, as well as where to go to find a very practical sort of how-to for these. So we've tried to link a resource for each one of these data collection methods that spells out how do you go about, for example, conducting a good survey, hosting an effective community meeting. How do you go about doing a thorough asset mapping process? So it is your choice which combination of these approaches you use, but we've tried to really be clear what are some of the strengths and what are some of the challenges of each of these so that you can make intentional choices. Okay, so we've talked about collecting some data anew. Let's go to the next slide. I'm personally curious again, so this will be a poll, and Kathy, please help me out with this. We're curious who in your prevention planning team is responsible for reviewing relevant community data. So you've collected some data. Who's responsible for actually looking at that data and figuring out, okay, what do we do with this? Select one of these that's the best option for your county. You can choose one option for one member of your planning team, a consultant, a subcommittee, all members of our planning team, nobody, maybe even somebody else. So just let us know, who's responsible for reviewing relevant community data. So I'll give you another couple seconds to respond here. And while I do, thank you, by the way, for everybody, including Rochelle, for sharing some of these additional resources in terms of where to find data. There's a lot of county and region specific resources out there that we don't have in the data playbook, but you all should check out. Okay, let's close that poll and let's see where folks are landing here in terms of reviewing data. So this is awesome. 49% of folks said all members of our planning team are responsible for reviewing community data. And that's great, because ultimately reviewing data is a team process. And that brings us into the next point here. So let's go to the next slide. And when we're thinking about analyzing community data, we have a few considerations. We want to make sure that the right folks are involved. And so it sounds like for most of our planning teams, there are multiple people. When you're thinking about doing this analysis process, you want to think about disaggregating your community data in appropriate ways. Why do we disaggregate? So disaggregating is sort of pulling together group data into relevant subgroups. We disaggregate because we're hoping to understand what disproportionalities exist. Where are there some groups that are greatly advantaged and some groups that are greatly disadvantaged in particular areas? So your steps in terms of disaggregating data, I think the first step is just you should do it and figure out how best to do it. But if we're to break this down, I think first you want to prioritize what are the subgroups that we really believe experience our community quite differently. And this might vary a little bit county to county. Some counties just have different demographics and different makeups than others. And so you'll want to consider things like race and ethnicity, age, sex, gender, location, immigration, disability, and or tribal status. And the reality is most all of these things are important, and they might be relatively more or less important for certain counties. So you want to prioritize that. What subgroups do we really want to look at? And then you want to assess, based on the data that we have and the data that we've collected, what ways of disaggregation are possible. Several of the existing data tools, including the 10 I shared before, allow you to disaggregate by at least some of these, but most of them don't allow for all of them. And so just looking at what's possible, I think, helps narrow things down. So then go about disaggregating your data. Have one person or an individual in your planning team break apart these overall metrics into smaller groups and see if there are any disproportionalities in these community conditions for one group versus another. If it's possible, the best practice is to look at multiple dimensions together. We know that a person's identity is not a factor of only one aspect of diversity. It's a factor of multiple. And so looking at the intersections of different kinds of diversity, different kinds of subgroups can be helpful if that's possible with your data. And then finally, review this. You want to really summarize and visualize your disaggregated data in a way that the rest of your team can understand. So the Data Playbook has some suggestions on how to visualize disaggregated data, and it has some additional resources on how to do each of these steps. So it's one aspect you want to think about in analysis. A second aspect is looking by geography. So we'll go to the next slide. We're big advocates, and we heard from many of the counties we talked to that mapping their data was one of the most useful parts of making sense of their information. Maps are just intuitive. They help you connect, kind of theoretical ideas to a really tangible place that we can go to, we can see, and we can imagine in our minds. So you want to consider here, what level of geography makes sense. And you probably want to go deeper than your county as a whole, but do you look at data based on different cities? Do you look at it based on different school districts? Zip codes are even more granular, and then census tracts are the most granular way of looking at our data generally. Again, it kind of depends on your location, how your county's set up, which of these makes sense. Many of the data tools that we shared previously allow you to map your data. So the KC Opportunity Map was one, that is a map. Another is the Strong Start Index. And so here's actually a screenshot from the index. This is zoomed into the particular census tract that I lived in when I was living in California in Berkeley. And you can see it's an area, the census tract is maybe 4 blocks by 6 blocks. It's very small. So we can zoom into a really particular area with this tool and understand almost by neighborhood how community conditions for young children differ. So that's an example. The Data Playbook also has some different suggestions. If the data source you have isn't a map, how do you go about mapping your data? What are some technologies that are fairly easy to use that allow you to see your community data in a map? So more of those in the actual playbook. So let's go to the next slide here. I mentioned before that data analysis is really something that is best done as a group. And I kind of use the term analysis as a team sport. You want to engage many individuals in making sense of what your data says, of determining the narrative that we're seeing in the data. And we think it's really critically important that we are engaging community members with lived experience of any of these adverse conditions we're looking at in the process of helping us understand what is the data telling us. We've heard before this session today of several great examples, having individuals involved in subcommittees, getting community liaisons involved. One approach that we suggest in the Data Playbook is hosting a community data party, quote unquote. And this is essentially a one-time event. something that engages community members around a particular piece of data and allows them to tell you, what is this meaning for them? So in the data playbook, we outline a process for exploring this. It really starts with figuring out what are the objectives of engaging our community, going through the right channels to invite community members, preparing our data for review so that it's accessible to the folks that are going to be involved. And then the day of or the evening of, giving people time to engage with that data, providing ample space to just discuss reactions, questions, start brainstorming implications among your group, and then having a process at the end of this to really follow up with folks, let them know how their input was used and is informing your plan going forward. So definitely encourage you, no matter what way you choose, to engage community members in helping you review and analyze data before you have come up with the story or the narrative of what your data is telling you. Okay, let's go to the next section here. We've gotten almost all of the way through the data playbook. We have just one more section to talk about, and this is the section around communicating your data, presenting it in ways that are engaging to your broader community. So let's dive into this. Go to the next slide. I think I've got a question for everybody. So I'm curious now, one last and final poll, bear with me, please. How would you rate your planning team's ability to communicate effectively with data? And just answer honestly, answer right now. Do you think that that's very low? Do we think it's moderate? Do we think it's very high? And I know from these presentations, some of y'all have done and are doing some really, really awesome work on this. So I wouldn't be surprised if this is high for some. Let's close this poll. Let's see where everybody's at here. Oh, great. Look at this. We've got a good distribution. So 8% very low, 23% low, 48% moderate, 17% high, 3% very high. And, I'm not surprised in this. I think that, we're in this work not because we're data communications experts, but we need to have a working knowledge of some of this stuff. So I think for everybody that answered, very low to moderate, hopefully this last section will be something that you can look at. And even if you spend 5 or 10 minutes with it, you can gain a little bit of confidence in integrating data into your next presentation, whatever that looks like for you. So let's get into it. So there are innumerable resources around data visualization and data communication. And we wanted to share in the data playbook some of the fundamentals of this topic so that y'all can imagine your next presentation, really kind of integrate data well into it. And also we acknowledge that your presentation is probably not just a data presentation, but you might be communicating your overall prevention plan. You might be advocating for additional community engagement or funding. So take these principles and try and build these into appropriate places in whatever kind of presentation you're giving. So here we'll share sort of 3 key principles of data communication. There's more on each of these in the playbook itself. The first key principle is just using color intentionally. Color is kind of one of the foundations of data communication. And I think the common challenge is almost using too much color, where color can become distracting. So unintuitively, the starting place is if you're creating charts, graphs, if you're trying to visualize data, start with shades of gray. Shades of gray are great for creating structure. So what are the axes? What are the titles? And then move beyond that to use 1 or 2 colors to draw interest to particular parts of your visual. So we'll see an example here in a second, but you want to be thoughtful about those colors. Here we have a couple of examples. One is a sequential color palette and the other is a diverging color palette. So when you are thinking about the colors that you use in your graph, think about which of these 2 might be more appropriate based on the nature of the data that you're sharing. Sequential tends to be useful for sort of sharing data about one thing. Diverging is when we're often sharing data that sort of sit on extremes. So if we're asking people about their likes and dislikes, for example, a diverging color palette might make more sense. When you're thinking about color, so use shades of gray as a baseline, use one or two emphasis colors to sort of attract interest. Keep in mind that color blindness is actually pretty common. 1 in 12 men have some form of color blindness. So there are a few different tools that we share in the data playbook around how to check and make sure that your visuals are accessible for folks who have this. One is the COBLIS, Color Blindness Simulator, and there are several others in there that y'all can check out. But be sure when you're creating visualizations, they're accessible in this way. So let's go to the next slide. So we talked about using color intentionally. The second principle is that less is more. When you're communicating a story with data, you want to just ask yourself, what's the main point of this chart in 30 seconds or less? And if the main point takes longer than that to explain, either edit down your explanation or break the visualization up into multiple components so that each component can be quickly understood. So I'm actually going to talk about this by just sharing an example. There are a lot of great writers about data visualization. The Storytelling with Data blog is one of the go-to examples here. And so I'm pulling an example with a couple of different charts. A less clear chart is on the left and a more clear chart is on the right. What makes the chart on the right easier to interpret? I think one, so we see use of color. We see three different colors in the chart on the left. We only see one on the right. And this author is wanting us to really focus on one particular series, the 2021 series, as opposed to the 2019 or 2020 series. So I think that's one difference. I think a second key difference between these that's instructive. So we're using titles in a meaningful way in this second example. So the key point, what do you want people to take away from this chart is, in this case, from 2019 to 2021, home prices have increased year over year. That's the key point, and it's in the title. So it couldn't be more clear. A third technique for less is more here is to remove any unnecessary structural elements. So in this, on the left, we see a bunch of grid lines. For example, we see a legend on the right. In the example on the right, we don't see the grid lines. And the series of data are labeled directly next to the series instead of having a legend sitting beside them. So that's just one example. I think the point here, the thing to walk away with is, could you really succinctly tell the story of this? And is there anything in this visualization that might be distracting, that might not help contribute to that story? So those are important principles to keep in mind when you're trying to communicate clearly and simply with data. Okay, and then the third, next slide here, the third point I want to emphasize is, you want to choose your chart wisely, and there are many different options, but it often makes sense to keep it simple. A table can be a fine visualization option. Bar charts tend to be really easy to interpret, and there are many others. So each different kind of chart is attuned to sharing particular kinds of data and particular ways of disaggregating data. So it's often easiest to just see some pictures. And actually the data playbook has pictures of each of these different kinds of charts. So you can imagine what might the scenario be that I would use any one of these. Like a dumbbell plot is the example here on the right. It's really great for comparing two groups or two time periods. So if some of the community data that you're emphasizing is doing that, it's comparing two groups, you consider this as a way of sharing some of that. So you want to just be thoughtful about choosing your chart. There are so many different options. Several of the most common are in the data playbook, and we share a few different libraries if you want to go above and beyond to choose to really dial in, what's the right visual expression for the data that we have. So let's go to one final slide around data communications. So we were kind of talking about the mechanism of how do we just display data? And I think the point is, visualizing data generally is helpful, but visualizing data tends not to be enough in and of itself. You want to situate your data within a story. So I think thinking back to high school, we probably learned about how a story tends to progress. It tends to follow a narrative arc. Every story has a beginning, it has a middle, and it has an end. And if you're doing any presentations with data, you want to think, is there a way that we can build a beginning, middle, and end to this presentation? often your beginning will be setting the stage. It'll be talking about, why is this data important, or why is our prevention planning team important? What was the situation that caused us to come together and do so much work? You'll have a rising action, something that is drawing people in, that's getting people to really care about whatever you're sharing with them. So this might be data about the challenges that your community faces, the things that you have discovered through engaging your community along the way. And then you have sort of a climax and a falling action. Often, towards the end of your data presentation, you may be really painting the picture of how people can become engaged and helping move your prevention plan forward. Again, this arc is going to really differ based on the nature of each presentation you're sharing, but I would encourage you to, whenever you're sharing data, think, what is the story that we put around this? So that we can, sort of capitalize on our natural ability to tell stories and to hear and remember stories, to remember the data that you spent so much time collecting, analyzing, and engaging community around. So let's go to the next slide here. Just in summary, again, we have a data playbook for prevention action planning, 3 chapters, 10 sections. There's a lot in here, but I want to emphasize that it shouldn't feel overwhelming. Any of these sections maybe takes 5 to 10 minutes to read. So wherever your team is at right now in terms of engaging with data, would encourage you to maybe just go to that one section, read that section, and try and pick a few really tangible things that you could use to make your practice of engaging with community data that much stronger. Let's go to the next slide. You can access this by going to economics.safeandsound.org/playbook. So here you'll see these 2 links. There's one link for just downloading the data playbook, and then there's also an executive summary. And the executive summary really goes into, why is this important? What situation should you be accessing the data playbook in? So it's helpful for folks to really understand what the point of this is. So let's go to the next, and I think this is the last slide. What are your next steps around this? So I would love for y'all to share, you'll have these slides afterward, would love for y'all to share these slides and or the executive summary with any prevention planning team members that weren't here today. I really tried to just share, like, what are some of the key points? And these may feel basic to many of you, but it's the foundation for good, effective practice of using data to engage and understand your community. So share these with the rest of your team members. Would encourage at least one prevention planning team member to read the full data playbook. And the last thing I'll mention is that OCAP has been generous enough to really work with myself and one of my colleagues so that we can provide some technical assistance to counties around this. So if you want some technical assistance in integrating data into your prevention planning process, we would love for you to send just a quick email to this website. So it's FFPSA Prevention Services at dss.ca.gov. So send an email there and just say, hey, I would like some help in integrating data into our process. Please send that by Friday, 6/10, even if you don't know exactly what that should look like yet, because we want to just manage the potential requests and make sure that we can allocate our time in a way that helps as many people as possible move forward in a meaningful manner. What could that look like? I think we're pretty flexible. It could just be a one-off meeting, all the way up to, hey, we don't have any idea what we're doing with data for our planning team yet. Can you help us really go through each step of this process? So I think there's some flexibility. We'll have to navigate it together, but please don't hesitate to reach out, because we want to make sure that y'all are feeling comfortable in using some of these resources and integrating this into your broader prevention planning process. So with that, that is all I have. I was going to say, Lisa and Christy, thank you for the shout outs in the chat. I really appreciate it. I think we have a few minutes here for questions. And maybe...
are there any additional trainings you suggest for getting more data analysis skills?
Yeah. I think that there are a ton of resources in the data playbook in each of these different sections. So I might actually defer to that there. And Guadalupe too, if there's a particular kind of analysis that you have in mind, just direct message me, because I can think if there are some others, okay?
I do want to highlight something that Justin from Annie Kesey Foundation highlighted about equity in data. And I think that that's probably a point that, especially as people are doing comprehensive prevention planning and looking at disproportionality, maybe what are some of the considerations that they should think about, or if there's tools or resources around that?
One of the starting points is just knowing we should look at equity, we should look at disproportionality. We should do something around that. So we need to be disaggregating data. So we're not just looking at county-wide metrics, but we're disaggregating by some dimensions that we have a reason to believe are important to us. And so generally that will be race and ethnicity, but it may also be age and the others that I mentioned. So I think just having that expectation, we need to disaggregate data. That's a good starting point. I think the second key thing I would mention is not jumping to the narrative of this is what the data says before trying to engage some community members or people who have experience with the conditions that are represented by that data to help validate that. And so I think that's where we talk about, kind of engaging community in a data party or engaging representatives on your planning team, but trying to get some community voice in there before we have sort of landed on this is what the data says, to help sort of gut check that, to make sure that it's not just our positionality, our point of view, that might be sort of separated from the actual feelings of community members. So I think those are the two things I would emphasize in terms of really trying to make sure that we're integrating equity, into our data practice.
We have another question in the chat. Do you consider data points within different partner disciplines, for example, probation, in data analysis, and data or research from those fields?
And there are some really cool examples when we talked with those 10 counties around the state of folks bringing their data sources from probation together with child welfare, together with the Family Resource Center, and sharing awesome resources across organizations that not everybody knew existed. So I think that's important. And in this, we would recommend kind of starting with, what is that data framework? Is it the social determinants of health? Is it one of these other ones, the protective factors, the elements of a resilient community? But starting with that, because that framework sort of is broader than any of our departments. It really helps us think, okay, if we're trying to understand what our community needs, what are the data points that point towards that? Naturally, each of our departments are probably gonna have different data points that we can contribute into that framework. But I wouldn't use the departments itself as a framework, because what if somebody from probation couldn't attend the community meetings or the planning meetings, for example? I just, you want to be thoughtful around having a framework that isn't dependent on the voices that have opted into your particular room.
Question also, what is the data not telling us?
Yes, absolutely. Jagdish, thank you so much for mentioning that, because I think that we mentioned representativeness. Any data collection activity is going to include some perspectives and is going to exclude some perspectives. It's going to be impossible for us to get the perspective of every single community member that we want to hear from. So there's always going to be something not said in whatever data we're looking at. And you're totally right. We just need to make some space for thinking about what could that look like. That doesn't mean that we can't use data to move forward. It just means that we want to be thinking about that and conscious of the limitations of whatever data that we've got.
I think we're going to move toward breakout groups. Lydia, if you want to lead us.
Awesome.
Yeah, thank you so much, Paul. We truly appreciate your time and the expertise you shared.